Let's get this thing started! Really bumps up the energy, doesn't it? All right, so that's lesson one. All right, this is going to be an issue here, isn't it? Should I hold this thing? Yeah, I might just do that. The physical performance here is more than this microphone can handle. So I'm just going to hold it like this. Oh, lesson two. All right, now, Brent Forrester, where do I come from? I came from West Malibu. That's where I grew up. Now, a little history lesson. America started on the East Coast. And the people who could not fit in on the East Coast, they drifted west. And they kept going until they got to California. And the people who really couldn't fit in California ended up in Los Angeles. And those that were too weird to be in LA went to Malibu. And then the people who were still kind of misfits, they went to West Malibu. And that was my parents. My stepdad was a hard-drinking Englishman. He just couldn't fit in with normal society. He was a radiologist, a smart guy. He married my mom, a cardiologist. This is a picture of my mom jogging in West Malibu. Look at that. There's nothing out there, okay? It's the frickin' country. There's no malls. There's no movie theaters. There was no radio stations. There was no internet when I was growing up. And my mom hated television. She just wouldn't let you watch TV in the house. So I had nothing. Did anybody here grow up watching TV? Yeah, all of you, okay? You all had a huge advantage over me in terms of having a career in television. I had none of that. What I had was books. Books were my entertainment. Now, if you just have books and nothing else, you have a slight advantage in school when it comes to writing, right? You're a little better than the other kids when it comes to writing. And I didn't know that. I thought that I was special because I entered a writing contest in 8th grade put on by the National Council of Christians and Jews. This is their website picture. This is them. Why does that always get a laugh? This is their picture. It's because it looks like the National Council of Christian and Jewish Stereotypes. That's what it appears to be. I love these guys because I entered a short story contest that they put on, and I won $50. And I kept the check, by the way. Here it is. Look at this, Brent Forrester, second place, okay? Second place in a short story contest, and that was it. I was like, I must be a writer. This is how you make money. You write short stories, they pay you. And I just went all in on short stories. I graduated high school, went to college, learned virtually nothing of use at college that you could make a living with. I took all the short story courses. And then I graduated, and there's some undergraduates here today, I assume, and you know this feeling. You graduate from college, and it's like one of the scariest things in the world. You're like, I'm supposed to now make a living. What do I know how to do? And really, all I had trained to do was write short stories. Well, I graduated, and I found there's not a lot of money in short stories. There's not that big short story box that I was hoping for. And so I had a feeling of maybe I could be a writer in general. Were there other jobs in writing, I wondered? What journalism? I took an internship in journalism. I took a course in soap opera writing. I would have become a soap opera writer. I never watched a soap opera in my life. I don't like soap operas. I would have done that for a living. But I really had no connections in any of those fields. I had one connection, as it turned out. The mother of a guy I'd gone to high school with was a television writer. And she was an extraordinary television writer, as it turns out. She was this lady, Susan Harris. Oh, Susan Harris is just a legend. She was a phenomenon. She was gifted, born with the ability to write great comic dialogue. She had no training. She was a secretary at MGM, and she got pregnant. She married a soap opera actor who got her pregnant, had the baby, and the guy dumped her. And she said, oh my God, I'm working as a secretary. I have no health insurance. I have no way to make a living if they fire me, and I've got a kid. But she was Xeroxing these television scripts that were coming across her desk, and she thought, maybe I could write one. She wrote a spec script of a show called Love American Style. And it came across the desk of a guy named Gary Marshall before your time, most of you, but he created a show called Happy Days, another one called Laverne and Shirley. He recognized Susan Harris immediately as a savant and said, oh my God, hired her. And she went on to create this show, The Golden Girls, which syndicated in the heyday of television syndication for $150 million. Soap opera actor died of lung cancer in New York, and Susan went on to great riches. And this was the mom of my friend. And so I called her and I said, Susan, how do you get into TV? How do you do it? She said, well, the process is pretty straightforward. You write 2 spec TV scripts. So you're just going to write a couple of half-hour television episodes that you're never going to sell. They'll just be your writing sample. And you know, if they're good enough and you can get them to the right person, then you try to get a job. At that point, I started watching TV. Post-grad from college, started watching TV and trying to figure out how do you do it. All right, well, the hit show at the time when I started doing this was called Murphy Brown. It looked like this. All right, now, I don't know if any of you have ever seen Murphy Brown. Murphy Brown was this bizarre show that was a giant hit on TV. It used to win all these Emmys, but I don't think it was actually really very funny. It had a kind of a formula, like a typical Murphy Brown joke. Candace Bergen, the star here, would you know, it was set in this like newsroom, and it was very political. And Candace Bergen would walk into the room and she'd say, "Sorry, I'm late. I was having chimichangas with Tip O'Neill." All right, and people, you know, would really back a truck of Emmys up to her house and just dump them there. Why? Because it sounded like smart funny. You know, now it was a terrible mistake for me to imitate this thing. I wasn't laughing at this thing, I just was imitating it. And also I was imitating what felt to me like a certain silliness. I thought comedy was silliness. And so I wrote a spec Murphy Brown. I got it to Susan Harris. And now, young writers, you may relate to this, some of you. I wrote this spec Murphy Brown and I gave it to Susan Harris, and I thought she was going to call me back the next day and tell me how great it was. She did not call me back the next day or the day after that. A week went by, which sort of surprised me. I thought my script of Murphy Brown was so amazing. 2 weeks went by. I actually was thinking that maybe she was getting me a job because my Murphy Brown was so good and was going to surprise me. I was completely delusional. I was totally wrong. My Murphy Brown was horrible. Susan Harris finally called me back and she said, "I've read half of your script." All right, here's the first great comedy knowledge drop. Susan Harris said, "I've read half your script. And here's what you need to know." She said, "Silly isn't funny." This was a shock to me. So much of what I was doing was just silliness. She said, "Write the way people talk." Now that is subtle. She was basically cueing me into naturalistic dialogue. But here's the big one that she dropped on me. If you take nothing else from coming here, this is the thing you want to take. She said, "Write about what is difficult for you, even painful, and trust that it will come out funny." I have never heard a better piece of advice in writing comedy and perhaps in the arts in general. What I did at that point was I took a very long time, probably 6 months, to write one more spec script. And I tried to write about something that was difficult for me, even painful. Now, there was a show on the air called Blossom. This was the star of Blossom, right? And I knew that Susan Harris's husband produced the show, so I thought maybe I can write a spec of this. I was at the time living in a house with my older brother, who was unambitious. And I was in some ways embarrassed for my own brother. You can hear the emotion even now that I felt about this. He was my older brother. I was embarrassed for him. I wrote a Blossom about that, in which Blossom's older brother works at the cafeteria and she's embarrassed for him. And just the fact that I was able to translate that true emotion into a standard television script was sufficient for Susan Harris to hire me on one of the shows that she and her husband produced. Now, Susan Harris, her son had a lot of friends who tried to get into TV. She never gave any of them a job. And I think it's because I listened to her and took that one thing seriously. I tried to write about what was difficult for me, even painful, in this form. Got my first job in TV. That's how I broke into TV. Now, they put me on a show. This was the factory where I worked. It was a sitcom factory. Okay, you have to understand, in the late 80s, early 90s, it was the heyday of the multicam sitcom. Okay, it was these shows where you hear the laugh track playing, you know, that stuff which we generally now think of as kind of low quality TV. 20 of the top 30 shows on television were multicam comedies. They were just cranking these things out. And there was a place here, Sunset Gower Studios, where I worked, was a sort of factory of them. And I just entered the factory in the dying era of the great sitcom boom. They put me on a show called Nurses, this show here. Now, Nurses was bad even for the standard of bad TV at the time. I've tried like YouTubing and watching episodes of this, and even the laugh track seems insincere. It's like it doesn't seem like they can even get the machine to laugh at this show. But the people on it were talented, and in particular what I learned was that the job of writing television involved coming up with stories, writing them out as half-hour episodes, and then punching them up. And this was a huge part of what people were doing in the television industry, is they were adding jokes, they were doing punch-up. And the punch-up specialist was the kind of star of the industry. And so I worked on this show for only 3 months before the entire staff was fired. The show was, they just said, whatever's happening on the show, we need to change it. And they just got rid of the entire writing staff, including me. And I was unemployed again. So I was just there long enough to see that the punch-up writer was king. And I'd made a little bit of money, even in those 3 months. And I managed, because I was single, to save this money, stretch it out over a year. And I went into kind of a deeper dive into comedy and comedy writing. And what I did was I started to analyze a truly good show for the first time. Instead of Murphy Brown, I started analyzing a show that actually made me laugh. It was this show, Roseanne. And Roseanne really holds up. I mean, that's a classic show. Great dialogue in that. Now, for anybody who is thinking of studying anything, you can use this method. Look at the thing and analyze it. You know, Aristotle did that back in the time of the Greeks, right? And he figured out all kinds of things about all kinds of things just by analyzing them. I could not really find any books on comedy that were of any value to me. But I did find that if I watched an episode of Roseanne and just wrote down a line that made me laugh and then try to analyze that, I always found something valuable there. Let me give you an example. All right, this is just a random scene from Roseanne that I remember. The show centers around Roseanne, who's kind of a big, big-voiced, blue-collar lady, and she's got a sister named Jackie. So Roseanne and Jackie walk into a mall. And as they walk into the mall, there's a band playing. It's sort of like old veterans in uniforms, and they're trying to play kind of patriotic music for donations. But the music is really bad. It's kind of like wah, 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 wah. And Jackie, to impress Roseanne, says, "Oh, I love live music." And Roseanne says, "Enjoy it while you can. They won't be live much longer." Okay. Now, you get the laugh there. What's going on there? Well, for me at the time, I was very interested in the setup punchline structure. I realized that almost every time you got a laugh, there was one person saying a setup line and one person saying a punchline. I love live music. It won't be live much longer. Setup and punchline. Well, just to give you a taste of what I discovered about the science of comedy, I realized that when a setup was disguised, the punchline was stronger. To disguise the setup so that you don't hear that there's a setup, when the punchline comes, it's a bit of a surprise, and the surprise amplifies it. In this case, the setup, I love live music, is a disguised setup because it gets a little laugh. When something gets a little laugh, you think of it as a punchline, not a setup. When it becomes the setup to another punchline, it's disguised. That'll just give you a feeling of how analytic I was about comedy at the time. I identified 14, 18 different dynamics within, setup punchline. And I wrote a spec Roseanne that was kind of like a showcase of joke structures that I had discovered while watching the show. And I don't think a lot of people had tried to do it that scientifically. Now, what happened at that time, I was in my 20s at that time, anybody who pursues a career in TV writing generally goes through this same early stage where you're basically working jobs to keep yourself afloat, working on your spec material, and then trying to meet the other people who are also trying to work on their spec material and network amongst them. Sometimes one of them gets a job and then can bring you along. In my case, I connected with a young woman named Maya Forbes, who went on to a spectacular career as a comedy writer. She was at this time just a graduate of Harvard and the Harvard Lampoon. She was well connected. It seemed like she was going places. She liked my Roseanne, and she gave it to a guy named Judd Apatow. This is a picture of Judd Apatow here on our right. Judd Apatow, seen here with a few other comedians, David Spade, and on the right, Adam Sandler. He was an aspiring comedian who was starting to get work as a producer. Judd's story is remarkable. Do you guys know his body of work? It's unparalleled. I mean, he did the 40-Year-Old Virgin. This is Superbad, Bridesmaids. He did a television show called Freaks and Geeks. Pineapple Express, he did the Anchorman movies. I mean, no one has ever compared to this guy. But he started out for a little comedy knowledge drop, where did Judd Apatow start out? He started out in high school. He fell for comedy because he was a lonely, isolated kid who would come home and watch the Merv Griffin show, a talk show at the time, and he just connected with the comedians coming off the TV. He just had this emotional connection with comedians. And in high school, he discovered that there was a radio station at his high school called KPRZ. And if he just called around to talent managers in New York, he lived in Queens, a borough of New York. If he called talent managers in Manhattan and say, I'm from KPRZ, I'd like to interview Jerry Seinfeld, they would allow Jerry Seinfeld to be interviewed by him. And so he would show up and interview Jerry Seinfeld. This is Judd in high school. And Judd told me that he said every time he interviewed a comedian, it was the same thing. He would knock on the door, the comedian would open the door, and then you would see on the comedian's face, oh shit, it's a kid from high school. And then give Judd the interview. And so he learned a tremendous amount about comedy just from going and meeting his idols. And by the time he did 1 year of college and dropped out. Judd did not finish college and just raced into being a comedian, writing for comedians. He wrote for Roseanne, did a special for her, and then incredibly, he one day met an actor in line at an Elvis Costello concert, a young actor named Ben Stiller. Some of you may have heard of him. This was what young Ben Stiller looked like. Ben was similar to Judd in that he'd gotten an early start into performing, acting, and comedy. Ben's parents were a vaudeville team called Stiller and Mira that would perform on the Ed Sullivan Show. And so Ben was born into the business. He runs into Judd Apatow at an Elvis Costello concert. And just in pure chutzpah, they start talking to him. What do you do? Oh, I'm a frickin' actor. Oh yeah? What do you do? Well, I'm a frickin' comedy writer. Oh yeah? Well, we should go sell a TV show. Let's do it then. Let's come up with one and sell it to Fox. All right, let's do it. And they did. They went to Fox, and on pure confidence and chutzpah, they did what could never be done now. They sold a sketch show to Fox. It's this show, The Ben Stiller Show. And this was this odd phenomenon. It ran 12 episodes, and it was a collection of very cutting-edge comic talents. Now, I had written my Roseanne and gotten it into Judd's hands when he was the executive producer of this show, and he hired me as a writer on the show on the basis of my Roseanne. And it put me in this world with these taste-making comedy writers. So one of them was this guy. This guy was our head writer, Bob Odenkirk. Bob was a sketch writer from Saturday Night Live who already had this reputation of being one of the great sketch writers alive. He was only in his late 20s at the time. He went on to be this guy, the star of Better Call Saul. If you ever see that, Bob is such a good actor that that is what he does now. He just acts. Also on this staff was Janine Garofalo, hero of mine forever. This is her kind of in her heyday. It gives you a feeling of who the kind of people were on the show. Tastemakers. What does that mean to be a tastemaker in comedy? When Janine laughed at something, you knew it was funny. That's what I would say about a tastemaker. This is something I did not have. I mean, I barely had been watching TV for a couple of years at this point. I was thrown in with these people because of my scientific analysis. I was able to imitate a comedy writer, and I was in here with the real deal at this point. Another person that I worked with on this show, I shared an office with this guy, was Dave Cross. Anybody familiar with Dave Cross? He became a star on Arrested Development. He's a comedian that I admire quite a bit. Dave embodied an element of the comic performer and comic writer that I've never forgotten. He was hired a little later than me on the show, and so we had to share an office. And so my first day of his work, I had been in an office all by myself, and then they added Dave Cross to my room. So I'm sitting at my little desk trying to write my little sketches, and I got this new guy in the room, and I kind of resented it. And Dave knew that I resented it, and I'll never forget working. And then at one point I look up, and Dave has left his chair, and he's just gone to the window, and he's just put his fingers up on the window, and he's sort of been waiting for me to look. And then I notice he's just singing very quietly. When will you know me as I truly am? I'm just a person who didn't want to share this office with him. It was so ballsy. He just called out the subtext, and he did it fearlessly. And the fearlessness is what I really picked up from guys like Dave in comedy. Now, the Ben Stiller show was on Fox, and at the time, the head of the Fox network was a guy named Sandy Gruschow, who is this guy. Gruschow was detested by the tastemakers in comedy because Gruschow actually had no taste. He had come up through the advertising and marketing departments in Fox, and he just did not care for comedy. He didn't like comedy. He didn't know anything about comedy. And I'll never forget coming by the office of Judd Apatow, who was 24 years old at the time. And Judd was talking to Gruschow on speakerphone. And I heard Judd say, Sandy, the sketch is called Legends of Springsteen. It features Ben Stiller pretending to be Bruce Springsteen in a bar. And he's performing for Andy Dick, who's dressed as a lumberjack. And if you don't know why that's funny, I can't explain it to you! Well, Sandy Gruschow canceled the Ben Stiller show after 12 episodes. We had actually shot a 13th episode, and Gruschow would not pay for it to be edited. All right? He had spent the money on the episode. He hated us and this show so much, would not pay for it to be edited. All right? Canceled the show. 6 months later, the show won the Emmy for Best Writing in a Comedy and Variety Show. What does that teach you, comedy seekers? It teaches you that sometimes the tastemakers are right, even when they fail. There's something interesting about that, isn't there? Young artists here who believe in your own talent and think you might be right and smarter than the next generation. Maybe you are right, okay? These guys were right, and that is part of your comedy knowledge. Now, this show ended. I'm suddenly unemployed again, but now I'm unemployed with about, 9 months experience in TV and an Emmy, all right? Where did that get me? Well, where it got me was this show, The Simpsons. The Simpsons at this time had been on for 4 years, okay? And it was just the premier comedy on television in terms of taste-making comedy writing. It was an incredible batch of writers, and after 4 years, it's a hit. Most of those writers left. They went on to do other projects. They were big shots now, and so a bunch of spots opened up on the writing staff of The Simpsons. And on The Simpsons, they were all writing something called The Bungalow. This is The Bungalow here. That's Conan O'Brien in the back. This is just a murderer's row of writers here. We've got George Meyer over here. Every single one of these people is from Harvard, but they were the superstars of Harvard. These were the geniuses of the Harvard Lampoon. It was the most intimidating writings room you could ever enter into. And literally the way this show was written was, in TV, we're in a group like this. At any given time, somebody's out writing a first draft of a script, which they bring back in, and then we punch it up. We rewrite it. So the way that works is there'll be a head writer sitting here, and everyone's got their scripts, and the head writer will say, okay, we need a new joke for Homer on page 3. Silence. And that silence could last 5 minutes, 10 minutes, as people tried to think of a classic joke that could be in The Simpsons. It was just so overwhelmingly intimidating. There was another young guy hired when I was, we'll just call him Bill C, to preserve his anonymity. Bill, great guy, talented guy, but his job was to write jokes, and he sat there for 3 months, and he never said a word. He was so afraid of embarrassing himself in front of these people, and that was the vibe of that room. It was just incredibly intimidating. And I was not necessarily qualified to excel in this room, but I survived, and here is how. I doubled down on the comedy analysis. And it was at this point on The Simpsons where I went into my really serious kind of scientific analysis of the joke, and I'll show you some of what I learned here. Okay, the first thing that will happen, if you go looking for how to write a joke, and you see books on how to write a joke, mostly what they're going to tell you about, unfortunately, is a very shallow kind of comedy, which is just wordplay. Wordplay, there's nothing wrong with wordplay, but it's almost never going to make you laugh. Try to find a pun that will make you laugh. Mostly puns just make you exhausted and kind of bummed out, right? A pun can make you laugh, but only in combination with other comedy elements, okay? What do I mean by that? Well, let's just take something very meat and potatoes. When I busted into comedy, I remember on the Ben Stiller show, before there was the internet, before there was YouTube, people used to pass around like actual VHS tapes of comedy. And the one tape that just guaranteed made everybody laugh was called The Farting Preacher. Did anybody ever see this? It's worth checking out. It's still pretty funny. It was just a very simple concept. It was this guy who was an evangelist preacher. And he has a bit of a tick when he performs. So, he'll say, oh, I can feel the Spirit of Jesus. And his eyes will squeeze real tight, flowing through me, right? And so somebody had just taken this guy, and every time he squeezed his eyes tight, they just dubbed in a fart sound, okay? And then you don't have to see it, and you're already laughing, right? Now, why is that funny? Well, the answer is the key element of comedy, really, which is the contrast between the sacred and the profane. All right, all you got to do is just make a list of things that are sacred. What is sacred? Religion, babies, funerals, old people. We know what's sacred in society, right? Just make your little list of this, right? What is profane? Similarly easy list to make. Sex is profane. Violence is profane. Bathroom stuff is profane. If you just start comboing these things up, just watch what happens. Like, okay, we just drawing lines between one and the other. Baby with a machine gun and the old nun who juggles dildos. That's for sure an animated show on Adult Swim. Somebody sell that right now, because you know that's the formula. That's just the formula, okay? But the same formula applies even in more sophisticated comedy. When I entered in the sitcom, the dying age of the sitcom, there was a scene that was considered the funniest scene ever written. What is it? Well, it's the Chuckles the Clown scene. Does anybody know this scene from Mary Tyler Moore? All right, so Jim Brooks, one of the legends of this form, had a show called Mary Tyler Moore, and there was a scene called the Chuckles the Clown scene, in which the star, Mary Tyler Moore, is at a funeral for a weatherman that they knew who was also a clown named Chuckles the Clown. So she's at this funeral, and she can't help laughing. Laughing in the funeral. And they're saying, they're giving the eulogy for Chuckles the Clown. Chuckles, oh, poor Chuckles, Chuckles the Clown. It was such a tragedy. He was in a parade. He was dressed as a peanut, and an elephant shocked him to death. And Mary is chuckling at this, laughing at this, right? And just that dynamic of her trying to keep from laughing in a funeral. What is it? What is sacred? Funerals. Laughter is profane. That combo is what drives that scene. All right, that's a key comedy element. What are other comedy elements? Well, one that I discovered just reading an interview with Charlie Chaplin was something I used all the time at the Simpsons. Charlie Chaplin was saying in an interview, he said, a man steps into a manhole. That is slapstick. But a man steps over a manhole and gets hit by a bus. That's funny. Why is that funnier? Because in the attempt to get to safety, he gets himself killed. In the attempt to achieve X, you achieve negative X. That is comic irony. That dynamic can be used over and over again. You notice it in plots. The two fellas go out to make $1 million and lose $1 million. That's a comic plot. Even Jackie in the Roseanne scene attempting to show off her sophistication says, I love live music. In her attempt to seem sophisticated, she seems unsophisticated. That's comic irony. By the way, you may notice in that Roseanne scene, there's also contrast of sacred and profane. Why? Because sacred, old men in military uniforms. That is sacred. What's profane? They won't be alive much longer. Death. All right? This was my analysis that I applied to The Simpsons. And what I discovered was there were other elements as well. I was working on The Simpsons, animated. It's a visual medium. I noticed that there were formulas of visual comedy too. The principal one is a reversal of scale. All right, you ever see like an image of like a big giant Hawaiian guy with a little tiny ukulele? Or a little tiny Mexican mariachi with a big guitar? Those are kind of intrinsically funny. Tell me, is this intrinsically funny? Yeah, it is. Two big guys on tiny motorcycles with little hats? Yeah, that's funny. Why is it funny? It's just a reversal of scale. All right, now I had a eureka moment one time while I was reading cartoons. I would just analyze anything comic I would analyze. And there was a cartoon called The Far Side. Anybody familiar with The Far Side? All right, this cartoon was a eureka moment for me. Let's just take a look at the image here. This is a cartoon in which a little baby, rather a giant baby, is sitting here on the tarmac, and there's two tiny pilots sitting on the baby's neck, and there's other babies, giant babies flying, and little pilots on their necks. All right. Now, what is it? It's intrinsically kind of comic. Without a caption, it's a little funny. Why? Well, in great part, reversal of scale. Babies are small, they're huge here. Pilots are large, they're small here, right? It's already a little bit absurd. Okay, it doesn't quite get the laugh though yet, until you add other elements. The other element is the caption. So here's the caption to this one. The pilot is saying, Engines, check. Lights, check. All right, let's get this baby off the ground. What happened? What happened? All right, in the attempt to seem authoritative with that, let's get this baby off the ground, that authoritative voice is in contrast with the absurdity of what I'm saying, and there's wordplay, a pun on baby. That's it. It's a pun, it's a comic irony, and it's an absurd image. I realized that when you comboed up these things, you actually could guarantee you were going to get a laugh, even in the Simpsons room. So, for example, some of you Simpsons fans may remember an episode in which Sideshow Bob is at an air show. This must have been season 6. Serious Simpsons fans will remember this one. But the scene in question is this. Bart is running from a villainous clown named Sideshow Bob. All right, he's got to hide in an office. We need a joke. Room goes into silence for 5 minutes. Okay, this is the joke that I wrote and figured out and put together and tried out. I said, okay, so Bart, he prays. He says, "Oh God, if you exist, please help hide this innocent boy from that killer clown." And then he jumps into the office and he hides behind a big Sparklets bottle, which magnifies his head to twice its size. All right, what's going on there? It's ironic, right? In the attempt to hide, he unhides. It's an absurd image. His head gets larger, and it's sacred profane. He was praying to God. I knew we were going to laugh. It did. They kept me on the show. What I began to do was every morning at The Simpsons, I would write jokes before work started. At lunch, I would do the same, and after work. I applied a lot of work ethic to the craft of writing jokes. And then, when I was at work, I would pretend to be making it up on the spot. And that was the final icing on the cake. If you have a joke and you kind of pretend to be making it up on the spot, it always makes people think you're a genius. And they kept me on that show for 2 years. Long enough in those long 10 a.m. to 10 p.m. days that I really did learn the craft. I wrote this, this was... This is where the slides really help. This is one of the guys that tormented me. This was the guy who I used to fool. This is Greg Daniels. He was one of the Harvard Simpsons guys and a frequent tormentor of mine. He was a Harvard guy who was smarter than me, and this was the guy who I would make my little joke crafts and then come in and pretend to make him up on the spot and fool Greg. Because of him and others, I stayed on the show and wrote this episode, Lemon of Troy. I put it up there just because, for me, this represents actually being able to do the craft. By the time I wrote this episode, I was able, I felt, to write a Simpsons episode at their level. And that's a lesson in itself as well. I hadn't been in the game that long. 2 years plus another year of prep. And you can learn a craft like this that quickly if you're focused on it for long hours. The creator of the show, co-creator of the show, Matt Groening was the animator, but the co-creator of the show was this guy, Jim Brooks. And Brooks was, it remains a hero for a lot of us comedy writers. I had kind of a falling out with Brooks. What happened was I had a 4-year contract at The Simpsons, and after 2 years, I thought I'd learned enough and I was going to leave. And so they made me have a meeting with Jim Brooks in which I enraged him somehow. I said to him, I know I have a 4-year contract. I know I've only done 2 years, but I've always heard you don't want a writer in the room who doesn't want to be there. And it was just something I had heard. But it turned out to be some kind of trigger for employers of writers. This is what they're really most afraid of, is that you'll just kind of phone it in or threaten to phone it in. And Brooks went absolutely bananas. He said a phrase, I've never heard this before. He said, don't go down that road. And then he said, don't float that balloon. And that was the end of my time with The Simpsons. I left and went off on my own way. Now, that was the academic bit that I promised you. Now we go into one long story, which will finish out a kind of a period of my career. And in it, from time to time, I'm going to try to pause and see if we can figure out what's funny about this. Okay. You heard my credits. I did other TV jobs for sure. But coming off The Simpsons, the principal thing that I did was I tried to pursue a career in movie rewriting. Now, when I entered TV, That was the fantasy for TV writers, was to move into movies. Movies were considered classier. They were kind of bigger. There were Oscars for movies. There were no Oscars for TV. There was Emmys, but they seemed much smaller. And the fantasy was to get out of TV into movies. The fantasy is exactly the opposite now. People try to get out of movies into TV. TV is really where you want to be. But at the time, this was the quest. All right, so this was an abbreviation of part of my quest in the movies. I went around trying to get feature rewrites, and I did get one, a splashy one through this guy. You'll remember Judd Apatow. As time went on, and I did The Simpsons, Judd aged up to be this guy, and he started making those movies that I was scrolling through before. Judd had come up through the comedy clubs with a comedian named Jim Carrey, this guy, and Jim Carrey by now had exploded as well. And so what happened was, as I was in my post-Simpsons period, Jim Carrey had blown up. He'd done Ace Ventura, he'd done The Mask. He was the biggest comedy star in the world. And he was about to do a movie called Liar, Liar. Right before this happened, he did an awards show for Clint Eastwood. And he needed a couple of jokes for Clint Eastwood, and my old friend Judd Apatow brought me, one of the writers from the Ben Stiller Show, over to Jim Carrey's house to write jokes for this Clint Eastwood tribute. And I did the thing that I have described, which is I wrote jokes beforehand, and I pretended to make them up on the spot. So this is how it went. I show up at Jim Carrey's house with Judd Apatow. Those guys riff and riff and riff. They come up with tons of comedy. I'm just sitting there in silence. Finally, they turn to me, and they say, "Do you have anything?" And I say, do I have anything? I don't. Well, no. This is a Clint Eastwood special. Clint Eastwood has all these catchphrases like, "Are you feeling lucky, punk?" and "Go ahead, make my day." But what about some of those catchphrases that for one reason or another didn't catch on? Like, "Say it, don't spray it," and "Eat lead, little girl." All right? Now, classic contrast of sacred and profane. Violence is profane. Little girls are sacred, right? Jim Carrey remembered the joke, did it at the Clint Eastwood special, got a big laugh. 6 weeks later, he signs a contract to do this movie, Liar, Liar. And he says, "I want to get a writer." He's doing it for Universal. They'll pay any amount of money for any writer Jim Carrey wants. He says, "Well, of course, I'd like Judd Apatow." But Judd Apatow isn't available. He's doing Freaks and Geeks. So he says, "Well, get me that kid who wrote me that joke about Eat Lead, Little Girl." Next thing I know, I'm hired to write to punch up Liar, Liar with Jim Carrey. All right, now, Jim Carrey at this time, he had come from poverty. And the secret of Jim Carrey's art was that he grew up with parents who really had nothing. In fact, less than nothing. His mom really suffered from mental illness. His grandparents seemed to be these raging alcoholics. And there was chaos in his house all the time. And Jim would calm the chaos with comedy. That was what he did. He told me that the grandparents would come over, rage, and then when they walked out the door and everything just felt so miserable, he would begin to imitate the grandparents. And the parents would laugh and calm would be restored. And that was the core of his comedy. But in addition, because he came from poverty, he loved to spend other people's money in kind of a comical way. And so, he's now this giant star. And he says to Universal Studios, "All right, so you're making Liar, Liar? Well, I live in LA, Jim Carrey. The director, Tom Shadyac, lives in LA. This writer we just hired, he lives in LA. But we want to do this rewrite at the Ritz-Carlton in New York City." And so they just flew us all out to the Ritz-Carlton here in New York City. And it was an experience of being up front and close to celebrity at its highest, which is really bizarre. Like, Jim Carrey could not go outside. All right, he could not go on the streets of New York because people would just come up to him constantly. The way I likened it was, when you drop fish food in a fish bowl and all the fish go tick, 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 tick. That's what happened. He would walk out on the street and the people would just go tick, 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 tick. All the faces would suddenly be looking at you. It was bizarre. It would make you paranoid. People would come up to him and go, "Jim, I love you on In Living Color. Can I have $100? And he would always give it to them. Always give it to them. He couldn't deny people money, this guy from poverty, but he didn't like it. And so he holed up in the Ritz-Carlton and just wouldn't leave for the week that we were working there. He also, at that time, he kind of had an unhealthy connection, I think, to marijuana. And he would smoke a doobie and go manic for like 14 hours. Only there was no audience except me. I was the only guy there. So for 14 hours, just Jim Carrey, the height of his power, just pitching shit to me. It was exhausting. I couldn't sleep for the first 2 days of the show. I just had it. I've never had that before. I've had insomnia. I haven't gone 2 days with insomnia. I remember on the third night when I couldn't sleep, going to a little bodega. You guys ever been to New York to see one of these bodegas? Walking in there, and this was how hallucinatory this job became. I went in there and in the middle of the night, and there was an Egyptian kid. He must have been 19 years old. He had a name tag that said John, but he told me his name was Muhammad. We had this deep talk. I said, I'm writing this movie, Liar, Liar. I don't know what the ending is, man. I haven't slept for 3 days. He says, Brent, you are Brent? My name is, I said John, but the name is Muhammad. I come from Egypt. These stories, they are not new. This man, this liar, liar, he is a lawyer. He was trying to get the money, the fame. He will get none of it, but he will get love. And I was like, my God, Muhammad, you've done it. I go back to the room and Why is that funny? Why is that funny? I don't know. It's just so absurd, isn't it? Like I'm trying to do something professional. I'm taking this madness, and it was madness. I still don't know if I was fired from that job. I was there for a week, and then the director brought me down to his room and he goes, Brent, this isn't working out. And I was like, it really isn't working out. It seems like Jim Carrey's stoned all day. We're not getting any work done. Maybe I should just go home. But I don't know. Maybe I was fired. I don't know. What I took from it, though, was some of you who are young or of any age, if you have artistic ambitions, there's something very interesting that happens when you're with somebody who is truly brilliant at the height of their powers. For me, I wanted also to be brilliant like that. What Jim had was what I did not have. He could spontaneously be funny for hours and hours at a time. I couldn't. I could barely be funny by working secretly and then presenting it as if I'd made it up on the spot. And it left me with this driving ambition. I also wanted to be a great and successful artist, and I thought maybe I could be in my chosen medium of the screenplay. And at a certain point, I decided, you know what? I'm just not going to work for anybody anymore. I'm just going to take the best idea that I have for a story and just pursue it until it is a brilliant work of art in screenplay form. All right, this is a dangerous thing to do. I had, especially because my best idea at that time, I had once walked into a thrift store and found a yearbook in a thrift store and opened it up and seen the name of a young woman, Zephyr Williams, written in handwriting there. And I found her picture, and then there were all these signatures written to her. And you could match the signatures with the photos, and I thought, there's a great mystery in this. I should write a mystery about somebody who finds a yearbook in a thrift store. And I thought, I'm just going to commit myself to the story until I figure out what's brilliant about it. And I took like a year and a half by myself, writing and rewriting this thing. Now, like I said, I would apply a lot of work ethic to this, but when you apply a lot of work ethic to a weird, dark mystery alone, here's what happens. It starts out as this weird thing called the Vintage Yearbook, a Jimmy Forrester curiosity, and then like 4 months later, it's become Is Life Worth Living? An Eric Librarian. And then time continues and it becomes Panic Attack by Brent Forrester. And you can see I was slowly losing my mind. Why is that funny? Why is that funny? It's the same thing, isn't it? It's like in this quest for integrity and respect, I'm going down the rabbit hole, I think. At the time also, just adding spice to this, I was living in a duplex at the time. Like one unit over another unit. I had bought a duplex with my dad in this weird investment. And my dad was living downstairs and I was living upstairs. My dad had recently retired from the career in cardiology, and he was trying to write mysteries for this magazine, Ellery Queen magazine. He had remembered this from like his childhood, and so he was going to get published in Ellery Queen. It just added this weirdness that I was trying to realize my artistic ambitions by writing a mystery, and so was my dad. And by the way, he would leave his mysteries like on my doorstep in the morning, and they were truly weird. I never forgot that. I was so traumatized by his mysteries. One of them began this way. It just said, the first line was, a woman who's a doctor and also a boxer. I never understood this. Comes home and her boyfriend is breaking up with her, and the boyfriend says, "You're cold, Janet, cold like that robot arm you work on in the lab every day." Right? And my dad wanted me to approve of his mystery as I was trying to get the world to approve of my mystery. I was truly going down the rabbit hole. And I began to act out in bizarre ways as I was on this quest for some kind of vindication. So to give you an example, anybody ever see this movie, Madagascar? All right, Madagascar stars some actors, Chris Rock and Ben Stiller. Ben Stiller, you may remember from earlier in my career. All right, so Ben Stiller remembered me. He was in this movie, and they did a screening of an early version of this, what's called an animatic. It's the colored and also black and white version of the cartoon in process. And Ben called me up and said, they're going to do a screening of this thing over at DreamWorks, and you're an old writer friend of mine. Just come and give some notes on the screening of this, because I think maybe this movie may not be as good as they're telling me, and I just need that outside perspective. I say, yeah, it sounds great, right? So I go and to the screening of this thing. And, like I say, I'm very ambitious and in need of validation. And I watch this movie. I take 40 pages of notes in the dark. And then I think we're going to go to like a little room and discuss this thing. And instead we're taken to a room and there's 80 of the biggest comedy writers alive at the time. John Hamburg, who did Something About Mary, Steve Levitan, who went on to do Modern Family. It's just a murderer's row of giant writers. And there's 60 of them, okay? And if you can picture this, it's a giant room like this. I'm standing with my back against the wall. Jeffrey Katzenberg was the producer of DreamWorks at the time, is this guy. One of the most powerful producers that ever lived. And he's sitting at a table here, all these people around the table, and then people around the wall, and me. And he turns to the guy on his left and says, what did you think of the screening of Madagascar? And the guy says, oh, I thought it was fantastic, gives 5 minutes of praise, says nothing critical about it, right? Then the next person speaks for 5 minutes. I'm standing here thinking it's going to be an hour and a half before they get to me. And I made a decision, which was before they got to the third speaker, I stepped off the wall, and I said, Katzenberg! And the room just went frickin' silent, okay? You have to understand how powerful this guy was. Just that alone ended any chance of me ever working at DreamWorks again. But some part of me, probably at a deep level, wanted the attention. In my mind, I thought, you know what, I'm going to impress these fellow comedy writers. That'll be good for me. And so I said, listen, you've gathered 80 of us here to give notes on your film, but no one's going to tell you the truth because everyone's so afraid of you. You're so powerful. They're just going to tell you what you want to hear. But let me tell you right now, this movie is not what it should be. You need more jokes in it. You've got 100 writers in here. Hire some of them to write some jokes. And I had no exit line. And so I said, with that, adios, amigos! And I walked out the door. I was acting out in bizarre ways as I wrote this screenplay. All right, we're almost at the end of Brent Forrester's comedy knowledge drop, and then I'll take questions and answers if you want them. All right, watch how this tale ends. A year and a half writing this screenplay, going down the rabbit hole, starting to act out in bizarre ways. All right, I'm represented at this point by the Endeavor Agency. Okay, there are talent agencies out there. UTA, CAA, Endeavor was a new agency, and I had gone with them. And they had represented me for a year, and they didn't seem interested in my mystery, which I'd been working a year and a half on. And I was starting to get very frustrated because I put a lot of time into it. By the way, at this point, I had gotten married, and my wife was pregnant. All right, and so I'm starting to feel like I've got to become a breadwinner, and my own agents aren't interested in this project. And I make a meeting with the agents so I can talk to them about this project and why they're not interested, right? And the night before the meeting, I have this feeling that I want to do something very strange. And I call a friend of mine. Now, you guys, some of you have watched The Office. You know this guy, Toby. This is an actor named Paul Lieberstein. Paul was originally a writer before he was an actor. He really is a writer at his core. I worked with him before. He was a friend of mine. I called Paul. He knew the whole story about my mystery. He knew I was going to have this meeting. I said, Paul, I have this thought that what I want to do in this meeting is I want to go wearing a wig and doing an English accent. And claiming to be a guy named Alex Norton, who is a talent manager who represents Brent Forrester now. And I don't know why I want to do this, but I feel this very strongly. And Paul says, Brent, you must do this. And I say, why? And he says, because if you don't, it's just going to be one of those meetings where they tell you what you want to hear and then nothing's going to change. But if you do this will be memorable. They'll understand that something's happening, right? So I say, okay. And I have a sleepless night. And I wake up very early in the morning and I call Paul and I go, Paul, okay, I'm going to do this like you said, but I don't know if I can do it. I didn't sleep very well last night. And if you tell me not to do it, I'm not going to do it. But if you tell me to do it, I will do it. Am I doing this? And he said, Brent, you must do this. But most important of all is once you begin, you must never break character. Because if you do, everything you're trying to do will be destroyed. Now, I don't know why he said that. He believed this with all his heart, and I believed it when he told me. And anyway, I went and did it. I went to the Endeavor Agency wearing a wig. Now, the wig, it was a wig my wife owned. It's this kind of black wig. And you could tell it was me, by the way. My red sideburns were peeking out from under the wig. I wasn't fooling anybody. And I went into this agency. Now, you got to understand, the agencies in Hollywood are designed to be the most sort of intimidating, important thing in the world. These giant desks, you know, like a barrier of desks as you come in, and these assistants are sitting behind them. I walk in with this wig, and I say, hello, I'm here for the Brent Forrester meeting. And the assistant behind the desk says, who are you? And I say, I'm Alex Norton. I'm a manager that represents Brent Forrester. They say, okay. And they put me in the waiting room. And then, you know, the agents who have never heard of Alex Norton, they send an assistant out, and they see that, oh, it's Brent Forrester in a wig claiming to be an English guy, right? And at this point, I remember I had a notebook at the time. I remember writing in the notebook, "It begins," right? I didn't know what was going to begin. I just knew something is going to happen here, right? All right, so 4 agents are in this meeting. The first one is named Lisa Harrison. These are decent people, by the way. Lisa Harrison is a nice person. She was a comedy agent, and she really liked comedy. She's a big kind of comedy person. And I say, "Hello, Lisa." And she says, "Oh, hello, Brent." And she's doing a voice back. But there's no comedy energy coming from me, right? I'm doing this thing, but actually there's some kind of strange, dark hostility, really, at the depth of this. And it quickly becomes kind of chilling. We go into this room. Lisa Harrison, Richard Weitz, who became one of the biggest TV agents in the world, John Lesher, who was the head of Endeavor and would later run Paramount, and his assistant, Don Saltzman, who was effectively my agent at that time. 4 of them in this room. And me saying, "All right, let's have a meeting," right? Now, John Lesher, the guy who would go on to be the head of Paramount, he's the guy who loses patience with this first. And he starts to say stuff like, "Maybe we should come back when Brent is here." And I say, and I just met him just eye to eye. And I said, "Have you got somewhere to go?" And they were like, "Oh shit, there's no way out of this." And so they had this meeting with me pretending to be Alex Norton. And they all had different ways of doing this, by the way. The Richard Weitz, who would go on to be this great television agent, he just negotiated with Alex Norton. He started saying, "I think what Alex is saying is that he'd like us to pay more attention to his screenplay, and this is a time that he's really trying to evolve." And I think what Alex, right? Now this screenplay, you have to understand, like I say, it was a mystery. There was a key scene in this mystery in which a car goes over a cliff. It's a key scene, and I had spent so long on this screenplay that I had illustrated the cover of the screenplay with this picture, this car going over the cliff, right? And so here I am wearing a wig, doing an English accent, and honestly, in my mind, I thought that what I was doing was something of high artistic integrity. I thought, this is a great fucking screenplay. They should be interested in it. But it's not for me to tell them to be interested in it. What I'll do is something so interesting in and of itself that they'll become interested in me and then by association it. None of that came across. I'm just handing this thing, I'm saying, "Do you like it? Do you know what it is? Are you interested?" And they thought I had lost my mind. They thought that this was some kind of suicide note in screenplay form. And I remember that Dawn Saltzman, lovely young woman, she was looking at me and she was saying, "Come back to us, Brent." And I thought, I can't. Paul Lieberstein told me I can't break character. And it went on for 30 minutes. I know, because I kept looking at my watch, like, Jesus Christ, Paul, how long is... At 30 minutes exactly, John Lesher, future president of Paramount, stood up and he said, "You know what, Brent, have a nice life." And he stormed out. And I felt suddenly this enormous relief, because really I'd wanted to leave the agency but didn't know how, and he kind of gave me the context. At that moment, I said, "You know what, Paul Lieberstein be damned, I'm done with this," and I took my wig off. And in one of the great moments of chutzpah for me, I said to the other 3 agents in the room, I said, "Wow, what's the problem with that guy?" And they all apologized for him. That's how crazy performance can be. I had hypnotized them into thinking I was the rational one, all right? Make of that what you will. There's some lessons there. But the comic irony of all that, in his attempt to become an artist, in some ways I sort of ended my own career. I mean, it's hard to come back from that reputation-wise. And there was a period there where I really felt like I was just unemployable. It was the comedy writers liked me, but the legitimate producers heard about my reputation. At one point, I heard that Ron Howard had hired me and then fired me from the job of writing a pilot before I'd even found out about it. And I said, my lawyer said, "You got hired and then they decided not to." I said, "What happened?" They said, "They found out that you have a reputation as a writer who cannot be controlled. A writer who cannot be controlled is unemployable." And that seemed to be the end for me. What rescued me? How did I come back? Well, frankly, it was this guy, in great part, Greg Daniels. Remember this dude, my tormentor from The Simpsons? This guy had kept making TV shows. He made King of the Hill, and then he went on and created this show, The Office. And Greg Daniels remembered me. I remember him calling me and saying, "Hey, I've got this new show, The Office. Would you like to come on and be a writer?" And I said, "You remember me as the great joke writer of The Simpsons." He said, "No, what I remember is you used to write jokes in the morning and then at lunch and then after work and then pretend to be making the jokes up on the spot." And I said, "Did I fool anybody with that?" He said, "No, you didn't fool any of us. But we really appreciated the work ethic." That is also a great takeaway for any of you who are thinking of a career in anything, right? You know, I tried to be a genius comedy writer. I learned a fair amount just by hard work and scientific exploration. But at the end of the day, it really was work ethic that got me there. And that really is maybe the best piece of comedy knowledge that you can have. Even if you're not gifted, as I certainly wasn't, Susan Harris was gifted. I was, aspiring. You can get there with analysis and hard work. When I was hired at The Office, the first episode of The Office that I wrote, still the best thing I ever wrote. If you guys watch The Office, it was this episode, Pam's Art Show. Oh, thank you guys. Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, there's 3 stories in that one, an A, B, and a C story. There's Dwight and the Bat, there's Michael goes to business school, and then there's Pam's Art Show, which is where the heart of this show is. What happened in Pam's Art Show? What is this about? I'll tell you what this is about. This is about me going back and going, write about what's difficult for you, even painful. This is an episode in which Pam, the secretary at The Office, who is an aspiring artist, has her first art show. She's very excited for everyone to come. Almost no one comes. One, Oscar's boyfriend comes and insults her art, saying it's motel art, and she realizes that she really doesn't have it at all. In the end, Michael Scott comes by and buys one of the paintings. He has no taste, and it doesn't really help that much, but it's a little bit of a balm, a little bit of a soothing moment for her. This is her hugging him at the end. This obviously was a metaphor for my own struggle to become a great artist and fail. And that is something that all artists go through continually. We always go through this. Even when we succeed, much of what we do is a failed aspiration. And that's part of the dignity of a career in the arts. But the upside is that sometimes you even get to write about that. The great lesson that I told you must leave here with is write about what's difficult for you, even painful, and trust that it will come out funny. That's what I did with this one, and that, my friends, is Brent Forrester's Comedy Knowledge Drop.